I am talking about the American Community Survey and the census, but I think the two presentations this morning almost remove my need to spend much time. So I am going to just whisk through that part and talk about the American Community Survey, which I will refer to often as the ACS, as really the successor to the long form. I guess I've convinced Linda, who's listened to me speak several times, on the importance of really understanding the statistics that you're giving to people. And that's really what I hope to accomplish today, to get you to realize that, okay, I'm giving a person a number, and what is that meaning of that number, to make you a more informed producer of the number, to kind of do statistics responsibly. So with that said, you know what the census is. It was spoken about in terms of its role in apportioning money, apportioning people in the House. And as you may remember, New Jersey actually lost a congressional seat with the 2010, in the aftermath of the 2010 census. So it is particularly important for us here. There's a lot of money spent. There's no way to verify that number of if it's 200 or 300 or 400 billion dollars, but a lot of money is spent based on where is the need, who is elderly, who is young. We saw Len talk about some of that stuff this morning. I hate motion on slides, but I guess that was to get your attention. The enormity of the census task could be an entire presentation. There were millions of questionnaires, and when I talked about, when I gave a similar talk prior to 2010, a lot of my talk was about the effort that the Census Bureau had put forth to get people to send the survey back. I love the quote from Jefferson from 1790 about the undercount. Well, the undercount is an overarching theme in the census. The role of making only a short form in 2010 was perhaps supposed to help, but it's not only the undercount, but the differential undercount, which has plagued the census in the last few census years that were an issue. And we will see that come up throughout what I'm talking about today. So it's not just a random sample of people who don't return the census. There's a particular groups that end up being targeted. For one, non-English speakers. And there was a lot done. Here's Dora. There was a tremendous effort done in 2010. Tremendous, and I'm not going to really spend time on it, but to tell you that there was differential undercount, and often the differential undercount are the people who are using the services. So here I have, dare I reference the 47%. Well, when I wrote this November 1st, you knew the reference to 47%. Hopefully you still remember what I was referencing in December. These slides are a few weeks old. What I want you to remember, though, is there was a tremendous amount of effort for the 2010, for the short form census that we heard about this morning. None of that happens for the American Community Survey. They don't publish census guides in 45 languages. They don't do the type of outreach. And so the problems of not counting are big problems still. Okay, so one of the themes, I've always wanted to use one of these blackboards that slide, and I've never done that. One of the overarching themes here is missing data. Okay, and I will talk about that repeatedly. And so from now on, whenever you hear about census data, you need to start thinking about what is the role of missing data. In the 2010 decennial census, what would happen is if the person didn't send the census form, another form was sent out, you cannot ignore missing data. And so an enumerator was sent. There were follow-up surveys. There is a lot of effort to get that count to be as complete as possible. if there is missing data, then one strategy, and I want to talk about this later on, is called imputation. Who would have thought that I could get 50 librarians in a room after lunch going, oh, I wonder what imputation is. It's actually quite interesting. If there's missing data, this is a statistical technique that is used. And for example, is this person, how old is this person? Well, if they gave me their birth year, I am imputing their age, plus or minus, and we saw John do some of that this morning. The race of the person, how do I do that? I could use it based on the other people in the household, a little risky, but those are the kinds of things that happen in making the data go from missing to complete. Date of birth, age, things, how long have you lived in your house? Typically, the rest of your family should be similar to you. This is not necessarily the case when we get to the more complicated questions of the ACS. Okay, so after the 2010 census, with the millions, billions of dollars spent on follow-up and everything, the participation rate was 74%. Exactly the same number as had happened in 2000. So you could say, well, there might have even been less there, but anyhow, that's the number that we got for 2010. So in 2010, it was the first time that a short form only was given. You may remember there was something about 10 questions, 10 minutes, and the idea that this might increase participation. It apparently did not. And the long form was replaced by the American Community Survey. And as I mentioned, the mail rate did not increase. So that's the background, the setting. And I raced through it because I think some of that has happened. You heard about that this morning. And then the long form. Since 1940, as you saw this morning, there has been sampling of the participants in the census to get more detailed information without burdening the entire population. And so John showed the example of the question, the two people on the page that were chosen to be asked additional questions. That's what happened, but it got taken further and further and further, and there ended up being many questions up through 2000, and then with 2010, the long form has now been replaced. This actually is from 1940, Norman Rockwell and the census enumerator, and it's not easy to find nice census pictures. On the average, the long form was given to 1 out of 6 households. Not people, but households. And there was oversampling, which is a statistical term, but I think kind of self-explanatory, particularly in areas that were known to have a lower response rate. And then the results from the sample are extrapolated to everyone. So you may not have noticed this, but when you look at long-form questions, so long-form questions are, what language do you speak at home? What country did your family come from? Questions about commuting time to work, all the long-form stuff. When you look at the numbers, the people at the Census Bureau take care of it. So it looks like it's based on everyone. Kind of all that is done, behind the scenes. And hopefully that idea makes conceptual sense. It's very complicated statistically. I do not understand it fully, but basically the idea is what's called weighting to controls. And I'm mentioning that now because I've noticed it used in public documents related to the American Community Survey. And this is the idea. If there are 40 white male Hispanic heads of households containing 3 people in Trenton based on the short form, then the long form responses are weighted so it looks like it's based on 40 families. I'll go over that again. What happens is if you're trying to represent everybody who meets that combination of characteristics, but used on a sample, based on the sample, and you weight them. And it gets very, very complicated. But I hope that you can understand the basic underlying concept. But the weighting is done based on race, on location, gender, ethnicity. So it gets very complicated very quickly. And there is a lot of behind-the-scenes statistical mumble-jumble that nobody really will understand. And I've tried. I was actually researching this to learn about the American Community Survey, and I found out this has been going on all along on the long form. It was just not known, and it's not as widely publicized. So while it may be not that difficult to find 8 Black heads of household with 3 children in Trenton, it gets a lot harder as you get to different combinations of things, and that makes it statistically complex. So that is one aspect, one statistical aspect of working with the census. Another is imputation, which is the idea of, okay, I've weighted these based on who I gave the long form to. What do I do to handle missing data? And so it's a similar statistical concept. What I want you to know is that in the year 2000, 30% of the long form records had some aspect of income imputed. There is a tremendous amount of missing data in the long form, and we will see that's going to carry through to the ACS. Okay, and I'm going through it very quickly, but I just want to introduce you to the idea of missing data, of imputation, and I'm going to say imputation for missing data, and then weighting. I think these make sense, these concepts. Weighting a sample to look like everyone, or to look like the population. So those are the 2 concepts that I think are crucial to understanding the American Community Survey and using it as a sophisticated user. Okay, and are there any questions? Makes, yeah.
When you say missing data on the long form, does that mean that question was not completed or filled out?
Correct, correct. And you could have missing data on the short form as well, but the more questions, the more likely things are to be missing. This is not the kind of error like where the person doesn't remember how many kids they have or forgot how much money they made or anything like that. This does not go into the vagaries of, well, I commute to work on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, mass transit, and I drive on, none of that kind of error. These are just 2 aspects of the statistics. Okay, so now on to the American Community Survey, which is available in Spanish, but in no other languages. Okay, so what happened was in 2010, the long form was discontinued with the idea that the American Community Survey was going to replace the long form. Instead of a decennial long form, now we were going to have yearly data available with about the same level, the same types of questions as the long form with a few changes. The idea is the same. There are some places that return less. We're going to survey them more heavily. We're going to have imputation of missing data, and we're going to weight so that if we're having a sample of people, those people are going to count as many times as we need them to in order to make it look like we sampled the population. Okay? So those statistical concepts that were underlying the long form, the sampling differently depending on where you were, weighting, and imputation are the same as they were for the long form, but now there are new statistical concepts as well. Now we are going to introduce something called reference years. Now, and I can't remember if it was, I think, where's Len? Left. Oh, good. I can say he said these things, and he mentioned very briefly that there was 1, 3, or 5 years of data. That depends on the geography size, and I'll show that to you. Now, once you get census data for a particular place, you get it every year from there on. None of this waiting 10 years. There is also the acknowledgement of the margin of error, which I call Mo. And if I didn't go on the computer last night and start internet shopping, I would have looked for a picture of Manny and Mo and who is it? Jack. Jack. I like to have his picture here because I want you to remember Mo. And then also, as when I show you examples, this imputation rate. How many of you have ever heard about the imputation rate before I came? Okay, some. How many of you have not? Okay, well, now you're going to look at those American community surveys and go, this never said imputation rate before. But you will see it's actually there. I'm hoping to heighten your awareness of the issue of the missing data and imputation rates. Okay? So I've told you about the American Community Survey replacing the long form. I had said that it had increased to 295,000 households a month. That comes up to about the 3.1 million, I think Len said. It is given monthly. Like the census, you have to participate. It's available in English and Spanish, and it's very detailed. And it's supposed to take about 38 minutes to complete. I knew I was in trouble. Like, the American Community Survey had gone live. The second month, I'm on the phone with my mother, who's now 87. She goes, I don't know how much I paid for my water bill last month. And I'm like, oh my God, what's the chance that and she's trying to answer these questions. She doesn't pay her bill. Anyway, 38 minutes was more like 3 hours and 38 minutes. And I'm sure it was all incorrect. They probably imputed her. There are some questions that have been introduced since 2000, and you can see why. There are important things going on in this country, questions about food stamps. There's questions about mobility, where have you moved, and also questions about fertility, as we're all worried about that there's going to be nobody to pay Social Security for us. So those questions are new, but it's basically the long form type of questions. Unlike the census, they follow up with somebody calling you up and going over your answers. It's a huge expense, but this is the trade-off. Instead of surveying so many millions of people, now this is a survey that's given to about 3 million households a year, instead of before where it was given to 35 million households once every 10 years. I tried to find a more recent statistic than this. I didn't find one. I imagine it's not a whole lot different. When the American Community Survey went live in 2005, a third of the questionnaires required follow-up. So there's a tremendous amount of expense. The idea is here, it's worth it to get better data, but we will be surveying less people. Okay. So this is a new statistical landscape, very similar to the long form, with weighting to make the sample look like the population. Hopefully this is drumming into your head. Imputation for missing data, oversampling, and when they just changed the sampling now, again, they even went further into oversampling places that have low response rates. So very similar, but also a little different. Okay? oversampling of groups in certain areas, the idea of weighting to population controls, I hope that makes sense, and imputation of missing data, same conceptually as it was done before. Okay, and then I mentioned that there are these new concepts, and I will go through each of them in turn. You should have my slides in the packet. And what I wrote here is I'm just trying to make you aware of the issues of using the American Community Survey, and there are many. What you really would want to do is to look through the Census Bureau has done a remarkable job of educating people about the American Community Survey. And there are 10 or so of these compass books, they're called. But every one of you who uses the American Community Survey would benefit from looking at this very easy to understand handbook, where a lot of my remarks come from. Okay, the first concept that is different in the American Community Survey, and you will not notice this if you just get a table of data, is that now there is what's called a reference year. Before, Census Day used to be April 1st of 2010 or 2000. Now this is continuous monthly surveying. And somebody who gets surveyed in January is reporting about the previous 12 months. Somebody who gets surveyed in February is reporting about their previous 12 months, most of which are the same as the January person's, but not all of them. So there's that lagging of months. Yet when you talk about the 2011 data like Len did, he didn't really tell you that that's really based on almost 2 years worth of data because the reference years spanned throughout the year. So this would be an example of it. I think it makes sense, and I think the picture just kind of tells the story. If you received the ACS in January, here were your previous 12 months. If you received it in December, you were going back to your previous 12 months. But the year that now is represented as 1 year worth of data actually goes from January of 1 year through December of the next year, making it perhaps harder to interpret what you have. Does that make sense? Okay. The next thing you need to know about the American Community Survey is that the data availability depends on the size of the population that you're studying. And this has to do with privacy issues and statistical stability. But if, I assume you can read it here, if you are if you're interested in a location that has 65,000 people or more, then there is annual data available. If you are interested in a place that's 20,000 or more, you have to wait for 3 years worth of data to be pooled. And finally, if you're looking at any place smaller than 20,000, then you need 5 years of pooled data in order, you have to wait for there to be 5 years of data in order for you to have results. Well, now it doesn't matter so much because the whole cycle we've gone through the whole cycle. But there were years where people were waiting and waiting and waiting to get information on small areas, just the way they had to wait on the long form, but it's the same idea. Now we've gotten through 5 years of everything, and in fact the data that were recently released are actually the 3-year 2009 to 2011. Any questions about that? So one of the things that I would want you to be aware of as a user of these data, and I see it all the time, is the Census Bureau, blah, 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 blah. Well, now all of these data sets are just now lumped together under the Census Bureau. And I think the the gold standard of the decennial census no longer applies. And people are making statements about the data when they're actually not as strong as the original data. But it just said the Census Bureau, and they don't differentiate which of these files. Okay? So now that since 2005, let me just go back. Since 2005, there's been annual data through 2012 of yearly. Then there's these 3-year groups of data. We're up to the one over there. So there's actually been 5 data releases of 3-year data. And then there's been 3 releases of 5-year data. That's what's coming out right now, that 2007 to 2011. So you didn't notice, but I noticed Len talk about the 2011 data. Well, that wasn't really 2011 data. Some of it was, and some of it was really 2007 to 2011 data. And that's where your job is getting harder, is you're going to have to start paying attention to those things. And it is not made very clear. Okay, so annual updates, as we talked about how important it's going to be post-Sandy to see a year from now, up-to-date data, not having to wait till 2020 to find out what happened down the shore, as we like to say in New Jersey. Okay, but now comes another difficulty, and I do not know the answer to it, and I cringe when people ask me this. So which of those multiple data sets do I use? Well, typically you want to use the most recent one. For small places, you don't have any choice but to use the most recent 5 years. And depending on what you want to do, you might want to use the 1 year or the 3 year or the 5 year. You can imagine that, and you don't have to be statistically inclined to imagine this, that the 5 years worth of data are based on more people than 1 year worth of data. But then there's the trade-off. Well, that's got some data in there that's 4 years old. Is it worth it to me? And hopefully one of the slides I'll show you will help you answer that. If you are working with researchers who ask you, which of these should I use, you either have to refer them to that compass guide or you have to read it yourself, because it is definitely complicated. Talked about this, an embarrassment of riches. Do you use the 5, the 3, the 1? And certainly the multi-year are more stable, but they also get harder to interpret. I have a site here, and I could read this to you, although it's not that interesting to have it read to you. Let me try to explain it, though. You can't compare a 3-year file and a 3-year file if 2 of those years are overlapping. And so basically what they say here, this is like having kids. You can tell them what not to do, but you can't really tell them what to do. Comparisons should be based on non-overlapping periods. The comparison of 2 estimates for different but overlapping periods is challenging since the difference is driven by the non-overlapping years, but diluted across the number of years in common. So while you're stuck in traffic getting out of Princeton tonight, you can think about me telling you this. But the answer is, while the interpretation of this difference is difficult, these comparisons can be made with caution. They don't tell you how to do it, but so you need to be aware of it, and you need to be aware of it when you read studies. You need to be aware of, I see stuff all the time, this thing, increase, this thing, decrease. Yeah, really? Are you sure? You don't even tell me which census you're getting these from. So it says, when making comparisons across geographic areas, which is typically what you want to do not compare a 1-year estimate with a 3-year estimate with a 5-year estimate. They are not comparable. So it's a problem. Here are more things you should be able to reference if you need help. The Census Bureau is actually quite helpful, but they don't have the answer. There is actually an entire, here's the link down here, an entire web page devoted to comparing ACS data. So I am making you aware of this as a true issue if you are using American Community Survey data. Yes, you have more recent data, but it is not without a cost. Down here, where I have that little arrow, comparison quick guide, that would be a good quick place to start. You can print it out. You can have it lying on your desk, impress your colleagues. Does that all make sense? Any questions? Yes?
Can you combine 3 1-year estimates to compare with the 3-year estimates?
No.
You can't do that.
No. And I'm so glad that I work with demographers because they actually want to do like their own PUM stuff themselves, and it's like, oh, not my problem. Okay, so I talked about missing data, I talked about imputation, I talked about weighting to controls. One noticeable change now and I said this is exactly what they've been doing in the long form all these years. But one noticeable change is the fact that these issues play a more prominent role in the statistics that you get now. Before, it was all kind of hidden in that famous Appendix 2 that nobody ever looked at. Now it is there if you choose to print it on your tables. So you will see you will see mention of MO, you will see mention of imputation. Okay. Who took statistics in library school? Needs assessment? Who loved their statistics class? Statistics. People I know at Rutgers was more needs assessment, but people seem to hate it. You may vaguely remember something called the standard deviation, which was an indication of the variation in the data you were working with. That standard deviation is then used to compute what's called a standard error. And if this makes you sick, you can just ignore me, but the standard deviation, which really I think of as just variation, to get the standard error is divided by the square root of n. Remember that? Yes? What you really have to understand is that this means the size of your sample. And what I want you to understand, you can forget about everything else, but the bigger the sample, typically the better the estimate. And that, given what I've been talking about with 1-year and 3-year and 5-year and sample sizes, this is why the sample size is crucial. So what happens is if you are working with a small place, you are going to get estimates, but there's going to be a lot of error in those estimates. Okay? What we will see is that they're going to give us a margin of error in these numbers. I'm giving a big buildup, so when you see the tables, you're going to get, ooh, really? When you know the margin of error, it's giving you, this is the number that we think it is, but actually it's probably somewhere in this range. It's the idea of a confidence interval. It's the same idea as talking about poll results and saying they're plus or minus 3 percentage points. It's the same idea. Oh, this doesn't. Okay, so here's an example for Trenton. The percent of women who have had a birth in the past 12 months who were unmarried. So Trenton, you all know where Trenton is, I assume. And here are the estimates. I mentioned this was one of the new questions. And so if you look at this table, the estimate of the total number of women 15 to 50 is 22,272. That's meant to look like they went and counted the women in Trenton in that age range, but actually what they did was they weighted the sample to look like a population. And they've done that all along, except now they're acknowledging the margin of error. So in this table produced by American Fact Finder, there's 22,000 women, but the margin of error is, let me just say, 800. So it's 22,000 women plus or minus 800. So that really, this is an acknowledgement that this is based on a sample. And so really the number of women is somewhere between 21,200 and 22,800. And we say we're 95% confident, and that's the margin of error. Okay, I could handle that. That's a number I could work with. But now let's look at the percent of women who have had a birth in the past 12 months who were unmarried. Well, for all women, it was 64%, I'm rounding, plus or minus, I'm going to say 13. So the percent of women in Trenton who had a non-marital birth in the past year is between 51 and 77%. Okay, so that's a different story. Okay, now when we start throwing in a little bit of age groupings, or we put in race, then we start getting numbers that get to be pretty useless. So for example, if I look at women 35 to 50 years, the estimate's 31%, plus or minus 33%. I'm like, oh, that doesn't tell me a whole lot. So then we're 90% confident that it's between 0 and 65%. You're laughing. I did not pick the weirdest. In fact, when I did Princeton, it's worse because there are less people living in Princeton. And so seriously, this is the reality of dealing with American Community Survey data. For many of the things you care about, you're going to really want to make sure you have meaningful data. So now I've shown you Mo. You have to ask for that. You can opt to not have the margins of error. It's the responsible thing to do, is to look at the margin of error.
Have your margin of error driver?
Yes. Okay, and the other thing I said has been there, but you never noticed it. It actually is telling you the percent that were imputed, and that is on those American Fact Finder tables. Who's noticed that before? Really? There are actually people there that said they had noticed it. Okay, so now when you go use American Fact Finder, you're going to now notice the margin of error, and you'll notice the percent imputed. Make sense? Statistics really aren't that bad. So I showed you the example. I showed you using the margin of error on the non-marital fertility. In summary, we now have this American Community Survey that replaced the long form. It uses the idea of reference points, which the long form did not. There's multi-years of data, 1, 3, and 5, that Len talked about, and making it more complicated to interpret. And now you know about the margin of error, about imputation rates. Also, the differences in the way the data are collected. There's enumerators involved in following up. There is non-response And that produces missing data and imputation. There are my references. I think that's it. I have 2 minutes to go. Any questions? Yes?
Congress is trying to get rid of American Community Survey.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think will happen in the future? And right now, they preserved it.
Right.
Yeah, probably responses from a lot of people. What's going to happen in the future, and what do you think?
I don't know. I think again it was Len who mentioned, somebody mentioned going to internet surveys. I think that will help. I think, but nobody really knows the answer to that. Yeah.
Just a comment. Canada, which actually was considered the gold standard
Right.
for all surveys out there, they did make voluntary their version of the American Community Survey. And unlike this country where people just don't notice things like that, there the people really rose up. However, it's still discontinued. It's not just that the ACS would go away. And for all the faults that Elana talked about, it gets more complex than that. The way that we weigh our education surveys, our labor surveys,
Right.
health, everything is based on this. So if we don't have this, we can't properly weigh any other survey. And if we think there's a margin of error in this, imagine the average survey out there that has about 6,000 people.
So I'm not criticizing, I'm certainly not advocating. I would not want to be perceived as advocating for the elimination. I'm just wanting you, when you use it, to be aware of those limitations. And I think there are more limitations now than there were before. And Barbara is right. It will be a sad day when we get rid of the census in this country, or make it voluntary.
Yeah, thanks for this.
You're welcome.
Very interesting. And just to make people aware, maybe you can tell me why this is. Apparently there's more detailed information on the 5-year surveys than there are the 1 and 3 years. Like I was looking for languages spoken at home and a complete breakdown of, there were supposed to be 60 in Jersey City. And we found one of my colleagues here, whose name I don't remember because the email was so long ago, pointed me towards the 5-year survey, which had a much more extensive, you're shaking your head, no.
I don't think that's, it may not have been put out there, but I don't think the questions have changed. It may have been not enough for confidentiality reasons, but for Jersey City, I wouldn't have thought that was the case. It might have been you were looking at the wrong table.
Right, I couldn't find it on the 1 or 3 year, but then someone pointed to the
Len
5
is
year.
the person to call Len.
Yeah, okay.
Any other? That'll teach Len to leave early. Okay. Thank you.